Imagine Ireland in the mid-20th century, a beautiful but isolated island, a land of poets and farmers, known for its hardy hand-woven tweeds and rustic wools, but certainly not for high fashion. Now picture the American elite of the 1950s, women with names like Rockefeller and Kennedy, living in a world of glittering power and sophistication on Park Avenue. The woman who built the bridge between these two impossibly different worlds was Sybil Connolly, an Irish fashion designer who took the humble, honest fabrics of her homeland and transformed them into an international symbol of quiet, confident luxury. She charmed the most powerful women in America, including First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, with her revolutionary pleated linen creations that could be crushed into a ball and emerge without a wrinkle. In this video, we will follow her journey from a Dublin dress shop to the glamorous drawing rooms of New York and uncover the real person behind the legend. Was she a devout artisan, a master businesswoman, or a brilliant combination of both who forever changed how the world saw Ireland? To truly grasp the magnitude of Sybil Connolly's achievement, we must first immerse ourselves in the Ireland she emerged from. The mid-20th century was not a time of glamour for the young Irish Republic. The country had achieved its hard-won, bloody independence from Britain only a few decades earlier, and it was still finding its feet, defining itself in opposition to its powerful neighbor. During the Second World War, a conflict that convulsed the rest of Europe, Ireland remained officially neutral. This period, known within the country simply as the emergency, was a defining experience. While neutrality spared the nation the physical devastation of the Blitz, it plunged it into a deep economic and cultural isolation. It was a world of strict rationing, of shortages, of quiet, gray austerity. It was a country that had in essence turned inward, cut off from the currents of the wider world. The dominant political and cultural figure of the era was Taoiseach, Prime Minister, Éamon de Valera, a towering ascetic man who was one of the architects of the Irish state. His vision for Ireland was one of a deeply conservative, devoutly Catholic, and fundamentally rural society. In a famous 1943 radio address, he painted a picture of his ideal Ireland as a land whose countryside would be bright with cozy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contests of athletic youths, and the laughter of comely maidens. It was a romantic pastoral vision, a dream of a pure, self-sufficient Gaelic society untainted by the decadent modernism of the outside world. The reality, however, was far less romantic. The Irish economy stagnated. Censorship was strict, and the cultural life of the country was heavily policed by the Catholic Church. For a generation of young people, this vision of Ireland felt less like a dream and more like a cage. The result was mass emigration. The best and brightest, particularly women, were leaving in droves for Britain, America, and Australia, seeking opportunities and freedoms that simply didn't exist at home. In this context, the very idea of a world-class Irish fashion industry was not just unlikely, it was almost unthinkable. Fashion was what happened elsewhere, in Paris, in London, in New York. Ireland was a place to be from, not a place to be. Its national costume in the global imagination was a hand-knitted Aran sweater and a sturdy tweed cap, garments of function and tradition, not high style. Meanwhile, the global fashion landscape of the 1950s was being reborn from the ashes of the war, and it was dominated by one city, Paris. In 1947, Christian Dior had launched his revolutionary New Look, a style defined by opulent fabrics, padded hips, wasp-waisted corsets, and voluminous skirts that used yards and yards of material. It was a defiant celebration of extravagant femininity after the grim utility of the war years. It was also incredibly structured, formal, and expensive. The great Parisian couturier, Dior, Balenciaga, Fath, Balmain, were seen as artistic dictators, gods on the Olympus of style, who decreed the hemlines and silhouettes that the rest of the world would dutifully follow. Their work was about artifice, about transforming the female form into an idealized architectural shape. It was into this world, an Ireland looking inward and a fashion industry dictated by Parisian grandeur, that Sybil Connolly would introduce a radical new idea. She would propose a different kind of elegance, one not based on rigid construction and imported silks, but on the soft, natural, and authentic materials of her own land. She would take the rough fabrics of the Irish countryside, the wool of the Aran Islanders, the linen of the farmers, the tweed of the Donegal weavers, and transform them into something of breathtaking sophistication. Her success was not just about designing beautiful clothes. It was about redesigning the world's perception of Ireland itself from a quaint, rustic backwater into a source of unique and desirable modern style. Sybil's own story began not in Ireland, but in Swansea, Wales, where she was born in 1921 to an Irish father, a clerk with the Sun Insurance Company, and a Welsh mother. The family name was Connolly, a solid Irish name, but Sybil's connection to the country that would define her was at first one of heritage rather than birth. Her father's work meant the family moved frequently, and she spent her formative years in Waterford, a historic port city on the southern coast of Ireland. It was a conventional, comfortable middle-class upbringing. She was educated at a convent school, where the nuns taught her a deep appreciation for fine needlework, a skill that would, quite literally, stitch together her future. From a very early age, Sybil knew she wanted to work with clothes. A key moment, an anecdote she would recount throughout her life, was a childhood visit to the home of an aunt. In her aunt's bedroom stood a dressmaker's form. The young Sybil was utterly captivated by it. To her, it wasn't just a wire and cloth mannequin. It was a silent, elegant promise of a world of creation, a world where she could shape and form beauty with her own hands. This quiet, intense focus, this almost spiritual devotion to the craft of making clothes, was a trait that would remain with her always. At the age of 17, she decided to act on this ambition. In an era when most middle-class Irish girls were expected to become wives, mothers, or perhaps teachers or civil servants, Sybil's desire to enter the world of fashion was unusual. Against the initial reservations of her family, she pursued her dream. She was sent to London to apprentice at a dressmaking company owned by two Irish brothers, Bradley and Company. Their clients included members of the British royal family. So this was an opportunity to learn the craft at the very highest level. It was 1938. The world was holding its breath, teetering on the brink of war. Her time in London coincided with the Blitz, the terrifying German bombing campaign that rained fire down on the city. She spent her nights, like thousands of other Londoners, in air raid shelters, listening to the drone of bombers and the crump of explosions. But her days were spent in the workshops of Bradley and Company, learning the meticulous, disciplined craft of English tailoring. She absorbed the principles of cut, drape, and finish that would form the bedrock of her career. The experience was a crucible. It instilled in her an iron self-discipline, a quiet resilience, and an unshakable belief in the importance of quality and craftsmanship. After 2 years, with the war making life and work in London increasingly difficult and dangerous, she returned to the relative safety of neutral Ireland. In 1940, at the age of 19, she walked into a prestigious Dublin department store called Richard Allen and took a job. It was a move that would change her life and the future of Irish fashion forever. For the next 13 years, Sybil Connolly's life was one of quiet, diligent, and largely anonymous work. Her new role was at Richard Allen, a fashionable department store and dressmaker located on Dublin's Grafton Street, the city's most elegant thoroughfare. It was the Irish equivalent of a small-scale Harrods, a place where the wealthy women of Dublin, the wives of doctors, lawyers, and politicians, came to buy their outfits. Initially, she was hired to manage the ladies' showroom, a position known as a buyer. Her job was to be the store's eyes and ears on the world of international fashion. She would travel to London and, when possible, to Paris to see the new collections from the great Couture houses. She would sit in the gilded salons of Dior and Balmain, sketching frantically in a small notebook, absorbing the new silhouettes, the details, the fabrics. Her task was to then return to Dublin and work with the store's designers to create adaptations of these styles for the Irish market. It was a role that required an impeccable eye, a keen sense of what would sell, and a deep understanding of the tastes and limitations of her clientele. For over a decade, this was her world. She was a backroom figure, a crucial cog in the machine, but not its public face. She learned the business from the inside out. She learned about fabrics, about sourcing materials, about managing a workshop, and about dealing with demanding clients. She developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of fashion and an intuitive sense of what made a garment not just beautiful but wearable. It was a long, slow, and invaluable apprenticeship. During this time, she began to form her own distinct design philosophy. While she admired the artistry of the Parisian couturiers, she was also critical of their excesses. She found their clothes too rigid, too structured, and often impractical for the lives of real women. She began to dream of a different kind of fashion, one that was softer, more natural, and more comfortable, without sacrificing elegance. She also began to look at the materials around her in Ireland with a fresh eye. She saw the beauty in the rough, hand-woven tweed from Donegal, the creamy, undyed flannel of the Aran Islands, and the delicate, almost ethereal lace from Carrick-Maycross. These were not fabrics one would see in the salons of Paris. They were considered humble, rustic materials. But Sybil began to see in them a potential for a new and uniquely Irish form of luxury. Her big break, the moment that catapulted her from the back room to the design studio, came in 1952. And it came, as these things often do, by a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. The French-born lead designer Richard Allen fell ill just weeks before a major collection was due to be shown. With deadlines looming and no one else to step in, the store's owner, Jack Clark, found himself in a difficult position. He turned to Sybil. He had noticed her flair for sketching and her impeccable taste. He took a gamble. He asked Sybil, the quiet showroom manager, if she could perhaps design a few pieces to fill the gaps in the collection. Sybil, who had been quietly preparing for this moment for her entire professional life, did not design a few pieces. She designed an entire 60-piece collection. It was an audacious move, a declaration of intent. The collection was a resounding success with the store's established clientele. They loved the freshness of her designs, her elegant but wearable silhouettes. From that moment on, she was no longer just a manager. She was a designer, the new creative force at Richard Allen. The quiet apprentice had finally stepped into the light. The stage was now set for her to take her vision, not just to the women of Dublin, but to the world. And the opportunity to do so would arrive sooner than anyone could have possibly imagined. In the early 1950s, the Irish government was grappling with a familiar problem: how to build a modern economy and project a positive image on the world stage. After decades of political turmoil and economic isolation, the country was in desperate need of foreign investment and tourism. A clever new government agency, Fografilte, the National Tourism Publicity Board, was established with a mission to sell a new idea of Ireland to the world, not just as a land of saints and scholars, but as a place of vibrant culture and quality goods. One of their most audacious ideas was to target the lucrative American market by showcasing the nascent Irish fashion industry. In the spring of 1953, a series of gilded invitations were sent from Dublin to the most influential addresses in New York publishing. They were addressed to the titans of the American fashion press, the women whose words could dictate trends, launch careers, and move millions of dollars in retail. It was an audacious gamble. The press trip was organized under the guise of An Tostal, a new national festival intended to be a Gaelic-themed celebration of Irish life, but its true purpose was to entice these powerful editors onto a plane and show them that there was more to Ireland than shamrocks and Aran sweaters. Remarkably, they accepted. The guest list was a staggering display of fashion's global power structure. The undisputed leader of the pack was Carmel Snow, the legendary editor-in-chief of American Harper's Bazaar. Snow was, without exaggeration, one of the most important figures in 20th century fashion. She had an almost mythical eye for talent, having championed figures like Christian Dior and Cristobal Balenciaga. Critically for this story, she was also Irish-born, having grown up in Dalkey, just outside Dublin, before emigrating to America. She retained a deep affection for her homeland, but it was an affection tempered by her famously unsentimental and razor-sharp judgment. She was not coming for a dose of nostalgia. She was coming for a story. Accompanying her was her great rival, Bettina Ballard, the fashion editor of American Vogue. Where Snow was known for her artistic and often avant-garde vision, Ballard represented the pinnacle of chic, polished American taste. If a designer could win over both Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, they had effectively conquered the world. The group also included Anne Fogarty, a highly successful American designer in her own right, known for her youthful and feminine dresses. These women were not easily impressed. They spent their lives shuttling between the couture houses of Paris and the ateliers of Rome. They were accustomed to the highest levels of luxury, creativity, and sophistication. As they flew across the Atlantic in the relative novelty of a commercial airliner, their expectations for Irish fashion were likely modest, if not condescending. They were probably anticipating a charming display of folk crafts, some well-made but rustic tweeds, and perhaps some pretty traditional lace. They were expecting a pleasant, picturesque diversion. They were not, by any stretch of the imagination, expecting to find a revolution. The press tour took the American editors across Ireland, but the main event, the moment everything was building towards, was the grand fashion show. The organizers, in a moment of inspired genius, decided against a conventional venue. Instead of a stuffy hotel ballroom in Dublin, the show was to be held at Dunsany Castle in County Meath. This was a masterstroke of stagecraft. Dunsany was not a museum. It was the ancient, continuously inhabited home of Lord and Lady Dunsany, a family whose roots stretched back to the Norman conquest of Ireland. The castle itself was a magnificent rambling fortress, filled with centuries of art, history, and aristocratic grandeur. The choice of location was a deliberate act of branding. It immediately framed the clothes that were about to be shown in a context of nobility, heritage, and romance. This wasn't just fashion. This was a piece of a storied, aristocratic world. The models were not professionals, but the beautiful daughters of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, friends of the Dunsany family who volunteered for the occasion. The entire event was designed to feel less like a commercial presentation and more like an elegant country house party. As the American editors arrived on that fateful day, they were seated in the castle's magnificent drawing room. Other Dublin designers presented their collections first. By all accounts, their work was competent. They showed well-made suits and dresses that were heavily influenced by the prevailing Parisian trends. They were respectable, but they were not new. They were echoes of a song being sung more beautifully elsewhere. And then came the collection from Richard Allen, designed by their little-known talent, Sybil Connolly. The atmosphere in the room changed. The models didn't stride down a runway. They descended the castle's grand sweeping staircase, their gowns rustling against the ancient wood. They wandered through the room, pausing by the grand fireplace or looking out the tall windows toward the green Irish landscape, as if they were truly at home. The clothes were unlike anything the editors had seen before. The first shock was a series of evening gowns made from a material they could scarcely believe: Benin flannel. Benin was the traditional undyed wool, thick and sturdy, worn by fishermen on the Aran Islands to protect them from the Atlantic gales. It was a peasant fabric, the very definition of humble utility. Sybil had taken this fabric and, through the sheer brilliance of her cut and drape, transformed it into something of breathtaking elegance. She had crafted full-skirted, floor-length evening gowns from it, often adorned with nothing more than a simple velvet ribbon or a piece of traditional Irish silver. The juxtaposition was electrifying. The roughness of the wool against the delicacy of a woman's bare shoulders, the rustic honesty of the material against the high-fashion silhouette. It was audacious, it was romantic, and it was utterly original. Then came the tweeds. But these were not the drab, heavy tweeds of country squires. Sybil had worked for months with the weavers of Donegal, a remote region on the Atlantic coast famous for its textile traditions. She didn't just choose from their existing patterns, she commissioned new ones, creating colors inspired by the subtle, muted palette of the Irish landscape itself. A tweed might contain dozens of different colored threads, blended to evoke the gray-green of lichen. On a stone wall, the deep purple of heather in bloom, or the brilliant yellow of a gorse bush on a cliffside. The result was a fabric that was alive with color and texture, which she then tailored into elegant, light-as-air suits and coats. She showed blouses and dresses made from Carrick-Macross lace, a delicate, intricate Irish craft that had been on the verge of dying out. She didn't use it as a fussy, old-fashioned trim. She used it as a primary fabric, creating entire bodices that were as ethereal and translucent as a spider's web. But the true coup de théâtre, the moment that secured her legend, was the linen. Ireland was famous for its linen, but it was a fabric notorious for its tendency to wrinkle, making it impractical for high fashion. Sybil unveiled her solution: pleated handkerchief linen. She presented a series of dresses and gowns made from thousands of tiny, crystalline, permanently set pleats. The fabric shimmered and moved with an almost liquid grace. It was as delicate as a butterfly's wing, yet possessed a miraculous resilience. One of the American buyers present, from the prestigious department store B. Altman and Company, was so intrigued by the claim that the dresses were uncrushable that he asked for a demonstration. A model took off a floor-length white linen gown. It was crushed into a tight ball, and when released, it sprang back into its perfectly pleated shape without a single wrinkle. The room erupted in applause. The show concluded with what would become her signature piece, the first love dress. It was a gown of stark simplicity and breathtaking beauty, composed of a floor-length cascading skirt made from what was said to be over 5,000 individual pleats of fine white linen, with a simple fitted bodice and a single black velvet ribbon tied at the waist. It was pure, it was romantic, and it was a masterpiece of textile innovation. The American editors, who had seen everything the world of fashion had to offer, knew they were witnessing the birth of a star. The secret behind the miraculous pleated linen was a perfect example of Sybil's unique genius, a blend of historical knowledge and resourceful, almost domestic ingenuity. The technique was not, in fact, entirely new. She had discovered the principle while studying the ancient Egyptian collections at the National Museum in Dublin, where she saw linen garments from thousands of years ago that still held their pleats. She also knew that the famous Irish designer of a previous generation, Elveries, had experimented with a similar process, but no one had perfected it for modern use. Her method, as she later told the story, began not in a high-tech laboratory, but in a rather more humble setting. She was frustrated by the way linen creased. Taking a large fine linen handkerchief, she painstakingly folded it into tiny accordion-like pleats while it was still damp. Then, on a hunch, she placed the folded square of fabric into a baker's loaf tin and put it in the oven on a low heat. She essentially baked it. When it came out and cooled, she found that the heat had set the pleats permanently into the fabric. The challenge was to scale up this simple kitchen table experiment into a commercially viable process. She worked with a firm of textile specialists, the Brown family of Baldoyle, who had a business pleating fabrics for ecclesiastical vestments. Together, they developed a secret, patented method. Huge lengths of linen, sometimes as much as 9 yards for a single yard, of finished fabric were woven to her specifications. This fabric was then put through a mysterious process involving heat and a special chemical solution, compressing it into the thousands of tiny, shimmering ridges. The exact details of the process were a closely guarded trade secret, a piece of fashion alchemy that no one else in the world could replicate. It was this technical innovation born from a simple handkerchief and a hot oven that became the cornerstone of her international success. It was the magic trick that left the American press spellbound and begging for more. The autumn of 1953 was a whirlwind. True to her word, Carmel Snow, the indomitable editor of Harper's Bazaar, became Sybil's fairy godmother and general, orchestrating her American debut with military precision. An invitation was secured for Sybil to present her collection in New York City. The venue was not some minor showroom, but the legendary Waldorf Astoria Hotel on Park Avenue, the very epicenter of New York society. The event was to be a grand charity luncheon, co-hosted by a woman who was then the vice president's wife and would soon become one of the most recognizable figures in the nation, Pat Nixon. The pressure on Sybil was immense. This was not a friendly gathering in an Irish castle. This was the Crucible. In the audience would be the doyens of New York society, the formidable buyers from every major American department store, and the entire notoriously sharp-tongued New York fashion press. She was an unknown Irish designer stepping into the most competitive and sophisticated fashion market in the world. Her entire future rested on the next hour. As the day of the show arrived, the grand ballroom of the Waldorf was filled to capacity. The atmosphere was a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated skepticism. What could this woman from Ireland possibly show them that they hadn't already seen in Paris? Then the first models appeared. Sybil, with her innate understanding of presentation, did not try to replicate a slick Parisian show. Instead, she brought the spirit of Dunsany Castle to Park Avenue. The show was imbued with a quiet, romantic charm. The models walked with a natural grace, not the stilted theatrical poses of the French runways. And the clothes, seen now against the backdrop of New York's urban glamour, looked even more revolutionary. The audience was treated to the same series of revelations that had captivated the editors in Ireland. They saw the dramatic evening capes made from heavy black Irish tweed, a fabric usually reserved for a farmer's overcoat. They saw the elegant cocktail dresses made from Carrick-Macross lace, so delicate they seemed to be spun from mist. They saw the Benin flannel gowns, their creamy, undyed wool, a statement of rustic purity in a world of artificial dyes and synthetic fabrics. It was a collection that spoke of the land, of tradition, and of a kind of raw, elemental beauty. And then came the pleated linen. As the first love dress made its way through the ballroom, a palpable sense of excitement rippled through the audience. They had never seen anything like it. The way the thousands of tiny pleats caught the light, the way the fabric moved with a fluid, liquid grace, the sheer breathtaking ingenuity of it. It was a fashion moment. When it was demonstrated that the dress could be crushed into a ball and emerge without a wrinkle, the audience broke into spontaneous applause. It was not just beautiful, it was practical. It was magical, but it was also modern. The show was an absolute, unequivocal sensation. The buyers, who had come out of professional curiosity, were now scrambling to place orders. The press, who had arrived expecting to be politely bored, were now rushing to file ecstatic reviews. Sybil Connolly had not just met expectations, she had shattered them. She had brought a completely new voice to the international fashion conversation. The ultimate validation came shortly after. In August 1953, the cover of one of America's most widely read publications, Life magazine, was not graced by a movie star or a politician, but by two models in Ireland, wearing Sybil Connolly designs against the ancient backdrop of the Rock of Cashel. The headline was bold and declarative: Irish invade fashion world. Inside, a multi-page full-color spread celebrated her work. For a designer from a small Dublin store who just a year earlier had been a relative unknown even in her own city, this was the equivalent of winning an Oscar. It was a level of media exposure that money could not buy. It announced to millions of Americans that a new star had been born, not in Paris, but in the most unlikely of places, the quiet, green Isle of Ireland. The success of the Waldorf show and the Life magazine cover opened the floodgates. Orders poured in from the most prestigious department stores in America: Lord & Taylor in New York, Neiman Marcus in Dallas, I. Magnin in San Francisco, Marshall Fields in Chicago. Sybil Connolly was no longer just a designer. She was a brand, and her brand was selling fast. To understand why she was such a phenomenon, we need to look closely at who was buying her clothes and what those clothes represented to them. Sybil's clientele was not the fast, flashy set. She was adopted almost immediately by the quiet, powerful, and astronomically wealthy women of the American establishment, the so-called old money families who presided over the nation's cultural and financial life. These were women with names like Rockefeller, Mellon, DuPont, and Astor. They were the unofficial aristocracy of the American Republic. For these women, a Sybil Connolly dress was a form of reverse snobbery. In their world, overt displays of wealth were considered vulgar. The goal was not to look like you had just bought the most expensive dress in Paris. The goal was to look effortlessly, timelessly elegant. Sybil's clothes were perfect for this. They were luxurious, yes, but their luxury was in the quality of the fabric, the perfection of the cut, and the story behind them. To wear a dress made of hand-woven tweed or pleated linen was to signal a sophisticated, intellectual appreciation for craft and authenticity. It suggested that you were a woman of substance, not just a follower of fashion. It was a subtle code, and Sybil Connolly was its new high priestess. Her designs were also perfectly suited to the American lifestyle. While a Dior gown might require a lady's maid and a limousine, a Connolly dress was practical. The legendary, uncrushable nature of her pleated linen made it the perfect travel garment. A woman could pack a full-length evening gown in her suitcase for a trip to Europe, and it would be ready to wear the moment she arrived. Her tweed suits and wool dresses were ideal for a weekend at a country estate in Connecticut or a charity luncheon in Boston. Her clothes were for living in, not just for being looked at. Beyond the old money set, Sybil also found a following in Hollywood, but again, it was among the more refined stars. Julie Andrews was a devoted client. Elizabeth Taylor, then married to the Anglophile producer Mike Todd, ordered several pieces. But her most famous and influential client was a woman who embodied a new kind of American style, Jacqueline Kennedy. Even before she became First Lady, Jackie was a tastemaker. She had a keen eye for fashion and a preference for clean lines, innovative designers, and an understated modern elegance. She was a natural fit for Sybil's aesthetic. In 1961, now in the White House, Mrs. Kennedy commissioned Sybil to create a special dress for her to wear in her official portrait, to be painted by the artist Aaron Schickler. The dress was a masterpiece of simplicity, a full-length sleeveless gown made from Sybil's signature white pleated linen. It was the essence of her style, pure, romantic, and utterly timeless. The resulting portrait, which now hangs in the White House, is one of the most iconic images of Jacqueline Kennedy. Her choice to be immortalized not in the work of a grand French couturier, but in the creation of a designer from the small Irish Republic, was a powerful statement. It conferred upon Sybil Connolly the ultimate seal of approval, cementing her place in the pantheon of the world's great designers. She was no longer just a fashion phenomenon. She was part of American history. For 4 years, Sybil Connolly continued to design under the umbrella of Richard Allen, the store that had given her her start. But her international fame and her growing list of powerful clients meant that she had outgrown her origins. She was a global brand, and she needed a home that reflected that status. In 1957, in a move that was both brave and inevitable, she made the decision to leave the security of the department store and found her own independent couture house, the House of Sybil Connolly. For her location, she chose one of the most prestigious addresses in Dublin, number 71, Merrion Square. This was not just a fashionable address. It was a place steeped in Irish cultural and literary history. Merrion Square was the heart of Georgian Dublin, a magnificent square of perfectly preserved 18th century townhouses. Number 71, a grand 4-story building with a classic Georgian facade, had a particularly storied past. It had been the home of Sir William and Lady Wilde, and the childhood home of their brilliant, flamboyant son, Oscar Wilde. The choice was inspired. By setting up her couture house in the former home of Ireland's greatest wit and aesthete, Sybil was subtly aligning her brand with a legacy of Irish creativity and intellectualism. She wasn't just a dressmaker, she was an artist, an heir to a great cultural tradition. She poured her impeccable taste and her growing fortune into transforming the house. It was not to be a modern minimalist boutique. Instead, she restored it to its full Georgian splendor, creating an environment that was both a home and a place of business. The ground floor was turned into her elegant showroom, a series of beautifully proportioned rooms filled with Irish Georgian furniture, glittering Waterford crystal chandeliers, and fine Irish silver. In the winter, peat fires would be burning in the marble fireplaces, filling the air with the distinctive earthy scent of the Irish countryside. The upper floors housed her design studios and her meticulous workshops, or workrooms, as they were called. Here, a team of highly skilled Irish women, seamstresses, cutters, and embroiderers, many of whom would spend their entire working lives with her, painstakingly crafted every garment by hand. Everything was made on site to the most exacting couture standards. A visit to 71 Marion Square became an essential stop on the itinerary of any wealthy American visiting Ireland. It was an experience, a piece of theater that Sybil directed with perfection. Clients were not treated like customers in a shop. They were treated as honored guests in a grand private home. They would be greeted at the door by a butler in livery. They would be served tea and cucumber sandwiches from delicate bone china. And then Miss Connolly, as she was always known, would make her entrance. She was an impeccable hostess, poised, charming, but always maintaining a certain professional reserve. She would personally consult with each client, advising them on the styles and colors that would suit them best. The fashion shows themselves were intimate affairs, held in the grand drawing room, with models gliding between the elegant furniture. It was the antithesis of the crowded, chaotic shows of Paris. It was personal, it was exclusive, and it was utterly intoxicating. Sybil Connolly had created more than just a couture house. She had created an embassy of Irish style, a destination that perfectly encapsulated the romantic, aristocratic fantasy that she was selling. The house on the square was the living, breathing embodiment of her brand, and it cemented her status as the undisputed queen of Irish fashion. She was no longer just designing clothes. She was curating an entire world, a world her clients were desperate to be a part of. Truman Capote's famous quip that she sewed like a nun but sold dresses like the Pope sells indulgences was more than just a clever turn of phrase. It was a brilliant and concise dissection of the two halves of Sybil Connolly's paradoxical character. To understand her, you have to understand both the nun and the Pope who lived within the same petite, impeccably dressed woman. The nun was the aspect of her that the world saw most clearly. It was in the almost monastic devotion she had to her craft. Sybil was a legendary, fearsome perfectionist. Her work was not a job, it was a vocation, a calling that demanded absolute dedication. Every single detail of her collections was subject to her exacting microscopic scrutiny. She didn't simply design a dress on a sketch pad and hand it off to her team. She was intimately involved in every stage of its creation, from the spinning of the wool to the final invisible stitch. She would travel to the remote cottages of Donegal, sitting with the weavers in their homes to discuss the precise shades of yarn needed for her tweeds. She wasn't just ordering fabric. She was commissioning a work of art. She would bring with her handfuls of moss, lichen, and dried heather, insisting that the threads perfectly replicate the subtle, complex colors of the Irish landscape. She would then wait for weeks or months for the hand-woven bolts of fabric to arrive in Dublin. This commitment to traditional methods was inefficient, it was expensive, and it was entirely central to her vision. Her work with the famous Carrickmacross lace makers followed the same pattern. This delicate, almost ethereal craft, made by women in County Monaghan, was in danger of dying out. Sybil didn't just place orders. She formed a deep collaborative relationship with the lace-making cooperative. She studied the traditional patterns, which had been passed down through generations, and then worked with the needlewomen to adapt them, to make them feel modern and light. The result was a revival of the craft, providing a vital source of income and artistic pride for the women who practiced it. For Sybil, these artisans were not mere suppliers, they were her collaborators, the silent partners in her creative process. In her workrooms at 71 Marion Square, her discipline was legendary. Her staff, whom she always referred to formally as the girls, regarded her with a mixture of profound respect and sheer terror. She was Miss Connolly, a figure of almost royal authority. She would inspect every single garment before it left the house, her expert eye scanning for any imperfection, a crooked seam, a mismatched thread, a poorly set sleeve. Nothing escaped her notice. The garment would be sent back to be unpicked and remade until it met her impossibly high standards. This was the nun at work, a life of discipline, devotion, and a relentless pursuit of perfection. But then there was the Pope. This was the other equally crucial side of Sybil Connolly, the shrewd, brilliant, and utterly pragmatic businesswoman who understood the worlds of power, money, and marketing with an intuitive genius. The nun created the beautiful objects, but it was the Pope who understood their immense value and, crucially, how to sell them. She was a master of public relations long before the term was commonplace. As we've seen, her decision to stage her early shows in castles was a stroke of marketing brilliance. She instinctively understood that for her wealthy American clients, a dress was more than just a dress. It was a story, a fantasy. When they bought a tweed suit from Sybil Connolly, they weren't just buying a beautifully made garment. They were buying a piece of the romantic, aristocratic Irish life they had witnessed at Dunsany Castle. She was selling an experience, a dream. The house on Marion Square was the permanent theater for this dream. The Georgian furniture, the Waterford crystal, the butler, the tea service, it was all part of the carefully constructed brand experience. She cultivated her clients with the skill of a master diplomat. She knew their names, their husbands' names, their social schedules. She would advise them on what to wear for a weekend in Newport or a charity ball in New York. She became their confidant, their personal style guru. This personal touch created a fierce loyalty. Her clients weren't just customers. They were members of an exclusive club with Miss Connolly as their revered leader. And she was not afraid to charge for entry into this club. She knew the immense amount of time, skill, and rare materials that went into each of her creations, and she priced them accordingly. Her clothes were incredibly expensive, on par with the great Parisian houses. When a wealthy American client once balked at the high price of a deceptively simple-looking wool dress, Sybil is said to have fixed her with a cool gaze and replied with her famously dry, understated wit, "But, madam, it took the sheep its entire life to grow that wool." The client, utterly charmed, bought the dress immediately. This was the Pope at work, serene, utterly confident in the value of her blessings, and brilliant at securing the donation. This dual identity of the nun and the Pope, the artist and the businesswoman, defined her professional life. But who was the woman when the clients had gone home and the workrooms fell silent? Here, the picture becomes more opaque, for Sybil Connolly was, above all else, an intensely private person. In an age of growing celebrity culture, she remained resolutely guarded about her personal life, creating a mystique that only added to her allure. The most notable fact of her private life was that she never married or had children. In the deeply traditional Catholic Ireland of the 1950s and 60s, this made her an anomaly. For a successful, elegant, and internationally famous woman to remain single was a subject of endless fascination and speculation. Was there a secret lost love? Was she, as some whispered, a lesbian in a deeply homophobic society? Or was she, as she herself seemed to imply, simply a woman whose work was her life, her one true passion? The truth is, we will likely never know for certain, and perhaps it is not our place to. Sybil deflected all personal questions with a polite but impenetrable wall of privacy. It seems most likely that her work was indeed her all-consuming focus. The level of dedication required to build and maintain her couture house, to manage her international clients, and to oversee every detail of her collections would have left little time or energy for a conventional domestic life. She was, in essence, married to the house on Marion Square. Her creations were her children, but this life of singular focus may have come at a significant personal cost. Many who knew her, even her close friends, described her as being at times profoundly lonely. Her position as Miss Connolly, the head of a prestigious company and an employer to dozens, automatically created a distance between her and the world. She was the boss, the icon, a woman on a pedestal. This can be an incredibly isolating position. The easy camaraderie of equals, the simple comfort of being able to let one's guard down, may have been luxuries she could rarely afford. Her home, for all its Georgian grandeur, was often described as being meticulously tidy, almost unnervingly so. The home of a person who lived a life of extreme order and solitude. She was surrounded by beauty, but it was a beauty she had created and curated herself. One senses a woman who had built a perfect, elegant fortress around a very private and perhaps very lonely core. Her public face was one of serene confidence and impeccable style. Her private reality was likely far more complex, a testament to the immense personal sacrifices that were often demanded of trailblazing women who chose to build their own empires rather than marry into them. As Sybil Connolly entered the 1960s, she was at the zenith of her power and influence. The House of Sybil Connolly was a global byword for a certain kind of timeless aristocratic elegance. But the world of fashion, and the world at large, was on the cusp of a seismic shift. The carefully ordered, adult-dominated culture of the 1950s was about to be blown apart by a new and anarchic force, youth. The revolution began not in Paris, but, appropriately enough, on another island just across the Irish Sea. It was in London, on Carnaby Street and the King's Road, that the youth quake erupted. A new generation, the first to grow up after the war, was rejecting the staid conventions of their parents. They had their own music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. They had their own hangouts, their own slang, and they had their own fashion. A new breed of designer emerged, led by figures like Mary Quant. They were not interested in catering to society matrons. They were designing for themselves and their friends. They threw out the old rules of couture. They hiked up hemlines to create the miniskirt, a garment that was less a piece of clothing and more a declaration of independence. They used bright pop art colors and new synthetic fabrics like PVC. Their clothes were not sold in hushed exclusive salons, but in loud, trendy boutiques where rock music blared. Fashion was no longer about timeless elegance. It was about the thrill of the new, the shock of the now. This cultural tsunami had a devastating effect on the old couture system. The world of made-to-measure fittings, of painstaking hand finishing, of designing for a mature, wealthy client, suddenly looked staid, irrelevant, and hopelessly old-fashioned. The great houses of Paris were thrown into crisis. Some, like Balenciaga, would eventually close their doors, unable or unwilling to adapt. Others scrambled to launch ready-to-wear lines or prêt-à-porter to cater to this new, younger, and less wealthy market. This new era presented a profound challenge to Sybil Connolly. Her entire brand was built on the very principles that the youthquake was rejecting: timelessness, craftsmanship, and a mature aristocratic elegance. Her client base was aging. The daughters of her beloved Rockefellers and Mellons were not buying pleated linen gowns. They were buying mini dresses from Biba in London. Sybil was at a crossroads. She could have tried to chase this new market. She could have shortened her hemlines, designed a ready-to-wear line, and tried to compete with the new wave of designers. But this would have meant compromising the very essence of her brand. Her clothes were, by their very nature, the opposite of fast, disposable fashion. Their value was in the slow, patient work of the hand weaver and the lace maker. Faced with this dilemma, Sybil made a crucial and career-defining decision. She would not chase the fleeting trends of the youth market. She would remain true to her vision of couture and craftsmanship. But she would also, with her characteristic business savvy, begin to pivot. If the world was less interested in her clothes, she would sell them her style in other ways. She began to look beyond the wardrobe and towards the entire home. This was the beginning of her brilliant transformation from a couturier into one of the world's first true lifestyle designers. Instead of seeing the 1960s as a threat, she saw it as an opportunity to expand her empire, moving from the closet to the drawing room and beyond. It was a clever, strategic move that would ensure her survival and her relevance for decades to come. Sybil's response to the youth quake of the 1960s and the subsequent decline of traditional couture was not one of panic, but of quiet, strategic evolution. She recognized that while the daughters of her clients might be wearing miniskirts, her original clientele, the wealthy, mature women of the American establishment, still admired her taste and coveted the elegant world she had created at 71 Marion Square. If they were buying fewer couture gowns, she would simply sell them that same elegance in other forms. It was a brilliant pivot that transformed her from a fashion designer into one of the world's first true lifestyle gurus. She began to leverage her impeccable eye and her powerful brand name into a series of high-profile collaborations with some of the most prestigious names in home furnishings. She entered into a partnership with Tiffany & Company of New York, not for jewelry, but to design exclusive collections of fine tableware. She created exquisite floral patterns for their porcelain, translating the delicate beauty of an Irish garden onto the dinner tables of Park Avenue. She collaborated with the legendary English company Wedgwood to design her own line of fine bone china. For the luxury American fabric and wallpaper house Brunswick and Phil's, she created collections inspired by the Georgian architecture and antique textiles of Ireland. The same discerning taste that had once selected the perfect tweed could now be applied to choosing the perfect chintz. Her name became a byword for a certain kind of elegant, comfortable, and historically informed interior design. This new direction was a natural extension of her brand. The house on Marion Square had always been more than a shop. It was a showcase for a complete aesthetic. Now her clients could buy a piece of that aesthetic for their own homes. She began to take on interior design commissions, decorating the houses and apartments of her longtime clients in America and Ireland. She brought her signature style, a blend of grand Georgian elegance, comfortable furnishings, and a deep appreciation for craftsmanship to these projects. This diversification was not a retreat from her vision. It was its ultimate expression. She proved that her brand of Irish style was not limited to clothing. It was a complete philosophy of living, one based on beauty, quality, and a deep connection to heritage. While other couture houses were struggling to adapt to the new world of ready-to-wear, Sybil Connolly had cleverly sidestepped the entire debate, creating a new and enduring market for her timeless taste. Despite her immense success and revered status, Sybil Connolly's career is not without its points of debate. These are not scandalous controversies, but rather the complex questions that surround any great artist who turns their culture into a commodity. The first and most central debate circles back to her decision to largely eschew the ready-to-wear market. Was this, as her supporters claim, a principled stand for craftsmanship and exclusivity? Or was it, as some critics have suggested, a failure to adapt that ultimately limited her commercial reach and confined her to a shrinking niche market? The truth is complex. By remaining a couturier, she undoubtedly preserved the integrity of her brand and the artisanal skills she championed. However, it also meant that she missed out on the massive expansion and financial rewards that came with the pret-a-porter boom. Designers like Yves Saint Laurent, who successfully bridged the worlds of couture and ready-to-wear, became global commercial powerhouses in a way that Sybil never did. Her path was one of artistic purity, but it was also one of commercial limitation. The second debate concerns her relationship with the Irish crafts she used. Was she an innovator or a brilliant packager? She did not, of course, invent Donegal tweed or Carrickmacross lace. These were ancient traditions, practiced for generations in rural communities. Her genius was in her act of curation and recontextualization. She took these humble, often overlooked materials, and through her sophisticated design eye, elevated them to the status of luxury goods. She was a brilliant editor, seeing the potential for a ball gown in a fisherman's flannel. Some purists might argue that she was appropriating and romanticizing these crafts for a foreign market, but a far stronger argument is that she was their savior. Her international success brought unprecedented attention, prestige, and most importantly, income to these fragile craft communities, ensuring their survival for another generation. This ties into the final, most nuanced debate, the nature of the Irishness she sold. The Ireland presented by the house of Sybil Connolly was an Ireland of castles, of elegant Georgian drawing rooms, of charming, happy artisans weaving in picturesque cottages. It was a beautiful, powerful, and incredibly seductive fantasy. But it was, of course, an edited version of reality. It glossed over the economic struggles, the social conservatism, and the political complexities of the real Ireland of the mid-20th century. Was this a form of cultural misrepresentation? Perhaps. But it can also be seen as an act of nation-building. At a time when Ireland was struggling to define its modern identity, Sybil Connolly created a powerful and positive international brand for the country. She sold the world a dream of Ireland, and in doing so, she helped the real Ireland to dream of a more prosperous and confident future. She was, in essence, a cultural diplomat of the highest order, using tweed and linen as her tools of statecraft. Sybil Connolly passed away peacefully in her sleep at her beloved home at 71 Marion Square in May 1998, at the age of 77. She had remained fiercely private and tirelessly dedicated to her work right up until the end. Her death marked the end of an era in Irish design, but her legacy is profound, multifaceted, and continues to resonate today. Her single greatest achievement was, without a doubt, putting Ireland on the international fashion map. Before Sybil, the words Irish and fashion were rarely used in the same sentence. The country was a creative backwater in the eyes of the world. She almost single-handedly created a global identity for Irish design, one based on the pillars of natural materials, exceptional craftsmanship, and a unique romantic modernism. She gave Irish design a confidence and a global platform that it had never had before. In doing so, she became the undisputed godmother of Irish fashion. Every Irish designer who has achieved international success since, from John Rocha and Paul Costello to Louise Kennedy and Simone Rocha, walks on a path that Sybil Connolly first cleared. She proved that it was possible to build a world-class luxury brand from a base in Dublin, to stay true to a distinctly national identity while appealing to a global audience. She created the very idea that Irish design could be a desirable, exportable commodity. Her work also played a vital role in the preservation and revitalization of traditional Irish crafts. At a time when many of these skills were in danger of dying out due to immigration and industrialization, her patronage provided a crucial lifeline. Her sustained high-profile orders for tweed, lace, and linen gave weavers, needlewomen, and millworkers a new glamorous market for their work. She didn't just use their crafts, she celebrated them, placing them at the very heart of her couture collections and proudly telling their stories to the world. And what of her designs themselves? Decades later, they remain startlingly modern and relevant. In a world now grappling with the environmental and ethical consequences of fast fashion, Sybil Connolly's philosophy seems incredibly prescient. Her entire career was built on the principles of what we now call slow fashion. She championed natural, sustainable fabrics, like wool and linen. She advocated for quality, durability, and timeless style over fleeting trends. Her ethos was the very definition of buy less, buy better. Her pleated linen dresses, which last a lifetime and never go out of style, are a perfect antidote to the throwaway culture of the 21st century. After her death, the contents of her famous house were auctioned, and her archives were eventually acquired by the Hunt Museum in Limerick, preserving her legacy for future generations. The house at 71 Marion Square, that iconic embassy of style, remains a landmark on one of Dublin's most historic squares, a silent testament to the woman who filled its rooms with such beauty and ambition. So let us return to Truman Capote's brilliant observation. Was Sybil Connolly the devout, humble nun or the masterful, worldly pope? The truth, of course, is that she was and had to be both. Her story is a lesson in the necessity of that duality. She was the nun in her workshop, a monastic, almost obsessive perfectionist, utterly devoted to the sacred art of her craft. She truly believed in the beauty of a hand-woven tweed, the delicate magic of a piece of lace, the elemental grace of linen. Her reverence for her materials was absolute. But to bring that art to the world, to lift it from the cottages of Donegal to the penthouses of Manhattan, she had to become the Pope. She had to be a shrewd marketer, a charming diplomat, a steely businesswoman who understood the vanities and desires of the world's wealthiest women. She had to build her church, her magnificent house on Marion Square, and invite the world to come and worship at the altar of Irish style. The nun needed the Pope to fund her convent. Her life was one of immense trailblazing success, but it was also perhaps one of quiet sacrifice. She was the determined girl from a small, struggling country who, through her own singular talent and relentless grit, stood shoulder to shoulder with the giants of Parisian couture. She brought beauty and elegance to the world, and in doing so, she gave her adopted country a new sense of pride and a new, more glamorous place on the world stage. The enduring image she leaves behind is that of her most famous creation, the simple, timeless, pleated linen dress. It is, in many ways, a perfect metaphor for Sybil Connolly herself. It appears effortless, almost elemental in its simplicity. But beneath that serene, beautiful surface lies a story of incredible ingenuity, of painstaking craftsmanship, and of a secret, hidden process that transforms something humble into something of breathtaking, enduring beauty. She took the fabric of a nation and pleated it into a legend.